What happens when a racist officer's abuse of power collides with a truth he never saw coming? A young black woman is humiliated in public, only to reveal she's his new police captain. Secrets unravel, tensions ignite, and lives hang in the balance. Are you ready to uncover the shocking story behind the badge? The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. Lauren Davis gripped the steering wheel of her sedan, her knuckles pale against her rich brown skin. The distant glow of Birmingham's skyline faded in her rearview mirror, replaced by the thick darkness of Route 280. The weight of the day lingered like an invisible hand pressing against her chest. Her first day as the captain of Birmingham's precinct had been everything she expected, and more. New faces, old biases, and the whispers. She could hear them even now. First black woman captain? In this town? Let's see how long she lasts. Lauren tightened her grip, letting out a slow, measured breath. Those words weren't new. She had grown up with them in this very city, each syllable a thorn pricking at her resolve. They whispered to her as a child, the night her father was dragged out of their home by men in uniforms who saw his color before his humanity. That memory burned, vivid even after decades. His screams, her mother's cries, and Lauren, frozen, clutching the edge of the living room doorframe, too young to understand but old enough to remember. That night had shaped her. It had defined her. "I'm not them," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Her reflection in the windshield stared back, a reminder of how far she'd come. "I'll prove them wrong." The road ahead stretched endlessly, flanked by skeletal trees swaying in the night breeze. A flicker of light caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Headlights. They approached quickly, their intensity cutting through the darkness like a predator locking onto prey. Lauren frowned, glancing at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her hands instinctively tightened on the wheel as the headlights grew closer, bathing her car in harsh white light. And then the flashing red and blue. The familiar sting of adrenaline surged through her veins. Lauren's breath hitched, her mind racing. This wasn't new either. Her badge rested on the passenger seat beside her, gleaming faintly under the soft glow of her dashboard. She reached for it, then paused. Memories clawed their way back to the surface, her father's voice trembling as he tried to explain. The cuffs snapping around his wrists. The cold eyes of the officers who wouldn't listen. Her hand retreated, trembling. "Calm down," she muttered. "You're the captain now." She slowed her car and pulled onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch beneath her tires eerily loud. The patrol car behind her came to a stop, its lights painting the trees in ominous red and blue shadows. She rolled down her window, her heart pounding as boots crunched against the ground. The officer's silhouette loomed in her side mirror, broad shoulders, a deliberate stride. "License and registration," the voice barked, sharp and devoid of courtesy. It was a tone Lauren had heard too often. She turned to meet his gaze. The flashlight he held illuminated her face, and for a brief moment, she saw his expression falter, barely. He was white, middle-aged, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his badge read, Officer Reynolds. His eyes narrowed, the initial hesitation replaced by something colder. Suspicion. "Was I speeding, officer?" Lauren asked, her voice steady, her tone polite. "You were driving erratically," he snapped. "License and registration." Lauren reached into her glove compartment, retrieving her documents with deliberate care. She held them out, her movements slow and measured. Reynolds snatched them, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment too long before flicking to the papers. "And where are you heading this late?" he demanded. "Home," Lauren replied, her tone clipped but calm. "Home." He repeated the word as if it were foreign. His eyes drifted past her, scanning the interior of her car. His flashlight lingered on her badge, sitting openly on the passenger seat. Lauren noticed the moment his gaze froze. His expression darkened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. She could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "What's this?" he asked, gesturing toward the badge. Lauren kept her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. "That's my badge." Reynolds frowned. "You're a cop?" "I'm Captain Lauren Davis, Birmingham Precinct." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. For a brief moment, silence reigned. Then Reynolds let out a dry laugh, one devoid of humor. "Sure you are," he scoffed, his tone dripping with disbelief. "And I'm the mayor." Lauren felt the burn of frustration rising in her chest. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remain composed. "You can verify it. Call dispatch." Reynolds stepped back, shaking his head. His hand moved toward his belt, resting dangerously close to his holstered taser. "Step out of the car." "Excuse me?" Lauren's voice was sharper now, her calm facade slipping. "Step out of the car," Reynolds barked, his flashlight now aimed directly at her eyes. Lauren's heart pounded in her ears as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The crunch of gravel under her boots felt deafening as she stepped into the cold night air. The lights from Reynolds' patrol car cast her shadow long and distorted against the asphalt. She stood tall, her badge gleaming under the harsh beams, but Reynolds' expression remained unyielding. "Hands on the hood," he ordered. Lauren stared at him, incredulous. "You're making a mistake, officer." "Now," he snapped, his hand inching toward his taser. As Lauren moved to comply, a second patrol car pulled up, its headlights slicing through the night. Relief flooded her chest, but it was fleeting. The rookie officer who stepped out looked just as hesitant, his eyes darting between Lauren and Reynolds like a trapped animal. The weight of the night pressed down, heavier than ever. The cold of the night wrapped around Lauren as she stood by the side of the road, her breath visible in the frosty air. The weight of Officer Reynolds' eyes bore down on her like a challenge, a silent dare for her to assert herself. She could feel the tension thickening, growing sharper with every second of silence. The rookie officer approached cautiously, his face pale, his steps hesitant. His gaze darted from Lauren to Reynolds, his uncertainty written all over him. "Officer Landon," Reynolds barked, without taking his eyes off Lauren. "Keep an eye on her while I run her plates." The young officer froze for a moment before nodding. "Yes, sir." Lauren exhaled slowly, her frustration tempered by years of practiced control. "This is unnecessary," she said evenly. "You've seen my badge. You know who I am." Reynolds ignored her, retreating to his patrol car with deliberate slowness, his silhouette framed by the flashing red and blue lights. Lauren turned her attention to the rookie, whose hand hovered nervously near his belt. He was young, too young to have hardened his edges the way Reynolds had. His eyes flickered with doubt as they met hers. "What's your name?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the sharpness of the situation. "Landon," he stammered. "Officer Jake Landon." "Listen to me, Officer Landon," Lauren said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You know this isn't right." Landon shifted uncomfortably, his boots crunching against the gravel. He opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by Reynolds' return. The older officer's expression was a mask of disdain, his jaw tight as he approached. "Your plates came back clean, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook," Reynolds sneered. He pointed a finger toward the hood of Lauren's car. "Hands where I can see them." Lauren hesitated, her stomach twisting with indignation. She knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move could escalate this situation in ways she couldn't control. Slowly, she raised her hands and placed them on the cool metal of the hood. The cold bit into her palms, sharp and unyielding. Reynolds moved closer, the sound of his boots heavy in the silence. His flashlight beam danced across her back, the invasive light amplifying the humiliation of the moment. "You think that badge means you're special?" he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You people are all the same, thinking the rules don't apply to you." Lauren's breath hitched, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she cared to admit. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to remain still, her heart pounding with both anger and restraint. Behind her, Landon shifted uneasily, his discomfort palpable. "Sir, maybe we should—" Landon started, but Reynolds shot him a glare that silenced him immediately. "Quiet, rookie," Reynolds snapped. He turned his attention back to Lauren, leaning closer. "What's the matter, Captain? No clever comeback? No big speech about respect?" Lauren straightened slightly, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You're out of line, officer." Reynolds laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Out of line? Let me tell you something, Captain," he spat, the title laced with mockery. "Around here, you don't give the orders. You take them." The flashlight in his hand swung downward, and before Lauren could react, his foot lashed out, striking her shin with a brutal force that sent her stumbling. Pain flared through her leg, and she barely managed to catch herself against the car. The indignity of the act burned hotter than the physical pain, her fists clenching as she fought the urge to retaliate. The sound of a car horn shattered the tension, drawing all eyes toward the road. A small sedan had pulled over, its headlights illuminating the scene. A woman stepped out, her phone raised, its camera aimed squarely at the officers. "What are you doing to her?" the woman demanded, her voice loud and unwavering. Reynolds turned, his expression darkening. "Get back in your car, ma'am. This is police business." The woman ignored him, taking a step closer. "I said, what are you doing to her? She hasn't done anything wrong." Lauren looked up, recognizing the woman's face from the faint glow of her phone. It was Alyssa Carter, a local nurse she'd seen at community meetings. Alyssa's presence brought a flicker of hope, small, but enough to steady Lauren's resolve. Reynolds moved toward Alyssa, his hand gripping the radio on his shoulder. "You're interfering with an investigation. Get back in your car or—" "You mean harassment," Alyssa cut him off. her phone still trained on him. "I'm recording this, just so you know." The rookie, still standing to the side, took a step back, his hand falling from his belt. The cracks in his composure deepened as he looked between Reynolds, Lauren, and Alyssa. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Sir, maybe we should just stop." Reynolds whipped around, his face twisted with anger. "What did you say?" "I said maybe we should stop," Landon repeated, louder this time. "This doesn't feel right." For a moment, the tension seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Landon's words hanging in the air like a challenge. Reynolds' jaw tightened, his hand flexing at his side. Alyssa stood firm, her camera steady, while Lauren remained against the car, her gaze locked on Reynolds. "This isn't over," Reynolds muttered, stepping back. "But you'll regret this." His words were sharp, venomous, but they felt hollow, like the last desperate grasp of a man who knew the ground beneath him was beginning to crack. The morning light seeped through the edges of Lauren's blinds, but it did little to chase away the heaviness that clung to her. She sat at her kitchen table, the bitter taste of lukewarm coffee untouched in her cup. Her shin throbbed beneath the hem of her slacks, a cruel reminder of last night's humiliation. But the ache in her chest, anger, frustration, helplessness, was far worse. Her phone buzzed on the table, rattling against the ceramic mug. She hesitated before picking it up, already dreading the flood of messages waiting for her. The screen lit up with a notification. "Video of police encounter goes viral. Captain mistreated during traffic stop." Lauren's breath hitched as she opened the link. There she was, frozen in the grainy frame, her hands pressed against the hood of her car while Reynolds loomed behind her. The video played, capturing every biting word, every unnecessary act of aggression. Her stomach turned as she read the comments scrolling below. "This is disgusting." Another example of abuse of power. Protect and serve? More like control and humiliate. But then there were others. She must have done something. "Cops deal with worse every day. Why should she get special treatment?" "Looks staged to me." Lauren locked her phone, setting it face down on the table. The roar of the outside world felt louder than ever, even in the silence of her kitchen. A sharp knock at the door broke through her thoughts, and she stood, hesitating before opening it. Alyssa Carter stood on the porch, her phone in hand, her face set with quiet determination. "I figured you'd want to talk," she said simply. Lauren opened the door wider, gesturing for her to come in. "I wasn't expecting company this early," she said, her voice laced with exhaustion. Alyssa stepped inside, her gaze scanning the modest room before settling on Lauren. "You've seen it, haven't you? The video?" Lauren nodded. "Hard to miss when your phone's blowing up every 5 seconds." Alyssa crossed her arms, her expression firm. "Good. People need to see what happened. They need to know." Lauren exhaled sharply, her frustration bubbling to the surface. What they see is one moment. They don't see the context, the damage this causes. She paused, catching herself. "What I mean is, this doesn't help me fix what's broken in that precinct." Alyssa's brow furrowed. "Then what does? Staying quiet? Pretending it didn't happen? Because that's what they're counting on, Captain." The words stung because they were true. Lauren's silence had always been her shield, her way of navigating a system designed to push her out. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. "I'm not staying quiet," Lauren said finally. Her voice was firmer now, tinged with resolve. "But I need to do this my way." Alyssa's expression softened slightly, but her determination didn't waver. "Whatever you need, I'll help. Just say the word." Lauren gave a small nod, appreciating the gesture more than she could say. "Thank you. And thank you for recording. I know it wasn't easy." Alyssa's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't. But what they did to you, that's harder to watch." The weight of those words hung in the air between them as Alyssa left, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Lauren closed the door, her thoughts racing. There was no avoiding it now. The precinct would be in chaos. By the time she arrived at the station, the tension was palpable. Officers whispered in clusters, their eyes darting toward her as she passed. A few had the decency to offer nods of acknowledgement, but most avoided her gaze. The viral video had cast a spotlight on everyone, and Lauren could feel its heat. "Captain Davis!" The voice of Chief Donald Henson cut through the low hum of conversation. He stood in the hallway, his arms crossed, his face a mask of unreadable calm. Lauren stopped in front of him, her posture straight, her expression neutral. "Chief, mind stepping into my office?" he said, already turning toward the door. Lauren followed, her pulse quickening. Inside, Henson shut the door behind them, gesturing for her to sit. She didn't. "You've stirred up quite the storm," he said, leaning against the edge of his desk. Lauren met his gaze, her tone sharp. I didn't stir anything up. Officer Reynolds did. Henson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Look, Lauren, I'm not saying what happened wasn't unfortunate, but this kind of attention, it's bad for all of us. The department, the community, you. Her jaw tightened. You mean it's bad for you? Henson's eyes narrowed, but he didn't deny it. I need you to consider the bigger picture here. Public trust is already shaky, and if this spirals, it's going to take us all down. Lauren's voice was steady, but her anger bled through. Trust doesn't come from covering up mistakes. It comes from accountability. Henson straightened, his expression hardening. Watch yourself, Captain. You may be new here, but this isn't your playground. You don't get to tear it down just because you don't like how it's built. Lauren took a step closer, her voice low but resolute. Then maybe it's time for a new blueprint. Henson's silence was telling, but the look in his eyes was a warning. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. She turned and left without another word, the tension in her shoulders heavier than ever. As she walked back through the precinct, a familiar face appeared in her peripheral vision. Jake Landon stood by his desk, his posture stiff, his expression conflicted. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Lauren saw the turmoil behind his silence. But she didn't stop. Not yet. The precinct's walls felt closer than ever, the air thick with tension. Lauren walked down the hall with measured steps, her head held high despite the whispers that rippled in her wake. Every glance was a mixture of curiosity, doubt, and from some, outright hostility. She could hear fragments of their hushed conversations. Think she's gonna last? Not with this mess. Bet she's regretting that promotion now. Lauren clenched her jaw but didn't falter. She had expected resistance. But this? The viral video had drawn a line through the department. Some officers saw it as a call to accountability, while others rallied behind Reynolds, claiming he'd been set up or unfairly judged. Her office door loomed ahead like a refuge, but before she could reach it, a voice stopped her. Captain Davis. She turned to see Officer Sarah Coleman, one of the few female officers in the precinct, approaching her with a file in hand. Coleman's expression was tight, her tone carefully neutral. Morning, Lauren said, her voice even, though she could sense the tension in the air between them. I just wanted to say... Coleman hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. Not everyone here agrees with what Reynolds did. Some of us, we see what's happening, and we're with you. Lauren's posture softened slightly, a flicker of gratitude breaking through her guarded demeanor. Thank you, Coleman. That means more than you know. Coleman nodded, handing over the file. You're going to need all the allies you can get. She walked away quickly, her eyes darting nervously, as if she feared being seen speaking with the captain. Lauren stepped into her office and shut the door, the quiet wrapping around her like a fragile shield. She dropped the file on her desk and sank into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, sharper than ever. The knock at her door came seconds later, shattering her brief solitude. Chief Henson didn't wait for an invitation, pushing the door open with the authority of a man who had ruled these halls for decades. Captain, he began, his tone clipped. He didn't sit, looming over her desk with crossed arms. We need to talk. Lauren met his gaze, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. I'm listening. You've got a problem, Davis. And by extension, so do I, he said, his words deliberate. This video, the protests, it's bad enough for the department, but now the city's getting involved. The mayor's office is breathing down my neck. Lauren leaned forward, her tone measured. Then maybe we should focus on the real problem, the officer who created this mess. Henson's expression hardened. You think firing Reynolds is going to fix this? You're naive if you believe that. This isn't just about one officer, it's about perception. And right now, the perception is you've lost control of your team. The words cut deep, but Lauren didn't flinch. If holding my officers accountable means losing control, then maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's the system you've been running. Henson's lips pressed into a thin line, his frustration evident. Watch yourself, Davis. You're walking a fine line here. You want to make changes? Fine. But don't drag this department through the mud while you do it. Lauren rose from her chair, her voice steady but edged with steel. This department dragged itself through the mud the moment it let people like Reynolds operate unchecked. Henson stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head. You better hope you know what you're doing. He turned and left without another word, the door closing behind him with a sharp click. The moment he was gone, Lauren's shoulders sagged, the weight of the confrontation catching up to her. Her phone buzzed on her desk and she picked it up, seeing a message from Alyssa. Protests are growing. You should come down here. Lauren's stomach tightened as she stared at the screen. She knew she couldn't ignore this, but the thought of stepping into the chaos felt overwhelming. She slipped her phone into her pocket, grabbed her jacket, and headed out of the office. The scene outside the precinct was even more chaotic than she had imagined. A crowd had gathered, signs raised high, their chants filling the air with a mix of anger and hope. On one side, protesters demanded justice, their voices strong and unwavering. On the other, a smaller group of counter-protesters stood defiantly, their signs scrawled with phrases like, "Support our cops" and "No to mob rule." Lauren scanned the crowd, spotting Alyssa near the front, her phone raised as she captured the moment. The nurse's presence was a stark reminder of the power of witness, a truth that couldn't be silenced. Lauren made her way through the crowd, the tension palpable as protesters noticed her arrival. "Captain Davis!" someone shouted, their tone hopeful. Others turned, their eyes filled with expectation. Lauren felt the weight of their gaze, the unspoken plea for her to be more than just a figurehead. She stepped up to the edge of the steps, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. Her voice carried over the noise, firm and resolute. "I know you're angry. I know you're tired of being ignored, and I promise you, this fight isn't just yours, it's mine too." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Lauren's words weren't enough to drown out the counter-protesters on the other side, their shouts growing louder. She glanced over, her jaw tightening as she saw Reynolds among them, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. The sight made her blood boil, but she forced herself to remain composed. For now, the fight was far from over. The fluorescent lights of the precinct's evidence room flickered faintly, casting shadows across the rows of metal cabinets and dusty files. Officer Jake Landon stood alone in the far corner, his heart pounding against his ribs. He glanced over his shoulder, ensuring no one had followed him. The tension of the day had been suffocating, and the precinct felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Jake hadn't planned to end up here. Not tonight, not like this. But something about Reynolds' behavior gnawed at him. Reynolds' office had been unusually locked earlier that day. Jake had only meant to grab an old report for a routine follow-up, but when he jimmied the handle open, a file folder had slipped from the desk drawer. It was labeled simply, Case Hash 379. The number meant nothing to him at first, but its thick contents spoke volumes. He had tucked it under his arm and retreated to the evidence room, knowing full well the risk of being caught. Jake opened the folder now, his breath shallow as he thumbed through its contents. Photographs, reports, witness statements. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages, each word pulling him deeper into a web of misconduct that chilled him to the core. A grainy black and white photo showed a man being escorted out of his home, his hands cuffed behind his back. Jake's stomach twisted as he read the caption. Jeremiah Davis, June 12, 1997. He flipped to the next page, the details striking him like a physical blow. Suspected theft, no charges filed. Subject died in custody from undetermined causes. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered, the words barely audible. Jeremiah Davis, Lauren's father. The implications hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just some random file buried in the precinct's archives. This was a piece of history that had been deliberately hidden, its truth buried under layers of bureaucracy. The timeline matched. This was the case Lauren had likely referenced during her speeches, the story of the night that had shaped her career and, more importantly, her life. Jake's hands trembled as he turned the pages, uncovering more and more damning evidence. The names on the reports were familiar. Officers who had long since retired, their reputations untarnished. One name, however, stood out among the others. Chief Donald Henson. His signature was scrawled at the bottom of multiple reports, authorizing the mishandling of evidence, dismissing witness statements, and marking the case as resolved. Jake's chest tightened as he realized the depth of the cover-up. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps jolted him out of his thoughts. Jake froze, his heart racing as the door handle rattled. He slammed the file shut and shoved it into his jacket, quickly grabbing a random folder from the desk to make it look like he belonged there. "Landon?" a voice called, sharp and questioning. The door creaked open and Officer Sarah Coleman stepped inside, her eyes narrowing as they landed on him. "What are you doing in here?" Jake forced a casual shrug, holding up the random file in his hand. "Just checking on an old report. Needed some context for a follow-up." Coleman studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. "At this hour? Seems like a strange time to be digging through paperwork." Jake swallowed hard, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. "Could say the same about you." Coleman's lips quirked into a small smile, but there was no humor in it. "Touché. Just be careful, Landon. These walls have ears." Her words hung in the air as she turned and walked out, leaving Jake standing in the flickering light, the weight of case hash 379 pressing against his chest. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself, not for long. The file was more than just a collection of documents. It was a smoking gun. And it wasn't just about Lauren's father. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. By the time Jake made it home that night, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He tossed his jacket over a chair, the file still tucked safely inside. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, trying to process everything he had just uncovered. Every instinct told him to stay out of it, to keep his head down and let someone else deal with it. But his conscience wouldn't let him. Lauren's face flashed in his mind, the fire in her eyes when she spoke about justice, the quiet dignity she carried even in the face of blatant disrespect. She deserved to know the truth, and more than that, she deserved to know that someone in this damn precinct had her back. Jake pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over her contact name. He hesitated, the weight of the decision paralyzing him. Finally, he pressed call. The line rang twice before her voice answered, steady and calm. "Captain Davis? Lauren, it's Jake," he said, his voice unsteady but determined. "We need to talk. It's about your father." The silence on the other end was deafening, but Jake could feel the shift in the air, as though the very foundation of their world had begun to crack. "Meet me at the station tomorrow morning," Lauren said finally, her voice laced with something Jake couldn't quite place. Fear, anger, and maybe, just maybe, hope. Jake nodded even though she couldn't see him. "I'll be there." As he hung up, a sense of foreboding settled over him. He had taken the first step into something he didn't fully understand, and there was no turning back now. The sun was just beginning to rise over Birmingham, casting a pale orange glow across the city. But the tranquility of the morning was deceptive. Outside the precinct, the crowd had doubled overnight. Protesters filled the street, their voices echoing through the air in chants that alternated between demands for justice and calls for accountability. Homemade signs bobbed above the crowd, "End police brutality," "Justice for all," and the simple yet powerful, "Do better." Lauren stood just inside the glass doors of the station, watching the scene unfold. Her arms were crossed, her posture firm, but inside her nerves were raw. The tension was growing thicker by the minute, and she could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her. Across the room, Chief Henson sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders. The lines on his face were deeper than usual, etched with the stress of the last few days. "You've got to handle this, Davis," he said, slamming the receiver down and crossing the room toward her. His voice was low, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. "The mayor's threatening to get involved. If this gets any worse, it's your name on the chopping block." Lauren turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What exactly do you want me to do, Chief? Silence them?" Henson scoffed. "I want you to de-escalate this mess. Go out there, say something, anything to calm them down before this blows up in our faces." Lauren's jaw tightened as she glanced back at the crowd. She could see Alyssa near the front, her phone raised as she recorded the growing energy of the protest. Beyond her, a line of counter-protesters had gathered, their presence a stark contrast. Their signs were blunt, their faces set with hostility. Support our police, law and order, and the chilling, "Stay in your place." As if on cue, Reynolds appeared in the crowd, standing with the counter-protesters. His arms were crossed, a smug smirk plastered across his face as he scanned the scene. Lauren's stomach churned at the sight of him, but she forced herself to focus. "Fine," she said finally, "but I'm doing this my way." She pushed the doors open, the noise hitting her like a wave. The protesters quieted slightly as she stepped out, their eyes turning to her with a mixture of hope and expectation. The counter-protesters grew louder, their shouts filled with vitriol. Lauren took a deep breath, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "I hear you," she began, her words carrying over the noise. "I know you're angry. I know you feel like your voices have gone unheard. But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm listening, and I'm not going anywhere." A cheer rose from the protesters, but it was quickly drowned out by the jeers from the opposing side. One man stepped forward, pointing a finger at Lauren. "You're the problem," he shouted. "This whole mess started because of you." Lauren's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She met his gaze head on, her tone unwavering. "This mess started long before me, but I'm here to fix it." The man's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a scuffle broke out near the edge of the crowd. Two men, one from each side, had come to blows, their fists flying as others scrambled to pull them apart. The tension in the air erupted, and suddenly, the peaceful protest began to fracture. "Stop!" Lauren shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She stepped forward, placing herself between the groups. "This isn't the way!" Her words slowed the frenzy but didn't stop it entirely. Nearby, Alyssa caught her eye, her phone still recording. The look on her face was clear. This moment would define everything. Lauren turned back to the crowd, her voice firm and resolute. "If you want justice, if you want change, then we have to do this the right way," she said, her eyes scanning the faces in front of her. "We have to be better than this. Violence won't fix the problem. It only makes it worse." Slowly, the scuffle began to die down. The protesters looked at each other, their anger giving way to a reluctant calm. On the other side, the counter-protesters retreated slightly, their confidence shaken. But the damage was done. The fragile peace Lauren had tried to maintain was hanging by a thread. She turned back toward the station, her mind racing. Inside, Henson was waiting, his arms crossed as she approached. "Well?" he asked, his tone sharp. "It's under control for now," Lauren replied, her voice clipped. "But we need to prepare. This isn't over." Henson nodded, his expression grim. "You're right, it's not. And if it goes sideways again, it's your head on the line." Lauren didn't respond. She walked past him, her focus already shifting. She knew the next move was crucial, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. The stakes were higher than ever, and the balance of trust was as delicate as glass. Lauren sat in her office, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The sounds of the precinct outside her door were distant, muffled, an undercurrent of tension that had seeped into every corner of the building. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to clear her mind, but her thoughts kept circling back to Jake's call the night before. Her father. The mention of his name had cracked something open inside her. It had been years since she'd let herself dwell on that night, on the questions that had never been answered, on the whispers of a cover-up that she had tried and failed to expose. And now, Jake had found something that could change everything. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She straightened, masking the turmoil beneath a calm exterior. "Come in." Jake stepped inside, his expression uneasy but determined. He carried a folder tucked under his arm, its edges worn, as though it had been handled 1,000 times. He closed the door behind him, glancing over his shoulder before facing her. "Captain," he began, his voice steady but low, "I think you need to see this." Lauren gestured for him to sit, but Jake remained standing, his fingers gripping the folder tightly. He placed it on her desk and took a step back, as though the weight of its contents was too much for him to bear. Lauren opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning the first page. Her breath caught as she recognized the name at the top, Jeremiah Davis. She turned the page, her stomach churning as the details unfolded. The reports were incomplete, riddled with discrepancies, but the pattern was clear. Her father's arrest hadn't been about theft, it had been about power, control, and a system that thrived on silencing those who dared to challenge it. "How did you find this?" Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was in Reynolds' office," Jake admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I think he's been keeping it hidden. Maybe for leverage, maybe for something worse. I don't know." Lauren's jaw tightened, her hands gripping the edges of the folder. "Does anyone else know about this?" Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet. But there's more, Captain. This file, it's not just about your father. It's about the department. Henson's name is all over it." Lauren's heart sank as Jake continued, his voice steady but filled with unease. "He signed off on every decision. Suppressed evidence, ignored witnesses, closed the case before it even began. He knew, and he let it happen." The words hit her like a blow. She closed the folder, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her father. It was about the very foundation of the department she was now tasked with leading. It was about a culture of corruption that had been allowed to fester for decades. "We need to move carefully," Lauren said finally, her voice firm despite the storm inside her. "If we push too hard, too fast, they'll bury this again. We need a plan." Jake nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I'm with you, Captain, whatever you need." Lauren stood, her resolve hardening. "First, we need to confirm this. Every detail, every name. If we're going to expose this, we need undeniable proof." Jake hesitated, then added, "Captain, there's one more thing. I think Reynolds knows I took the file. He's been watching me all day, and I don't trust him." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to act fast. If he realizes what we're doing, he won't hesitate to destroy everything." Jake left the office a moment later, his shoulders visibly lighter, as though sharing the burden had eased it. Lauren, however, felt the opposite. The weight of the folder in her hands felt heavier than anything she'd carried before. As the door closed behind him, she opened the folder again, her eyes lingering on her father's photo. His face was etched with determination even in that grainy black and white image. She traced the edges of the paper with her fingers, her vision blurring as memories flooded back. his laughter, his warmth, the way he'd always stood tall, no matter the odds. "I'm going to finish this, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." The sound of raised voices outside her door jolted her back to the present. She stood, slipping the folder into her desk drawer before stepping into the hallway. Two officers were arguing near the entrance, their voices carrying over the din of the precinct. "Look, I'm just saying it's suspicious," one of them said, his tone defensive. "Landon's been acting weird, and now Davis is on some crusade? Come on, you don't think that's connected?" Lauren's presence silenced them instantly. They exchanged nervous glances before muttering excuses and walking away. The unease in the precinct was growing, and Lauren could feel it creeping closer with every passing moment. Back in her office, she pulled out her phone and dialed Alyssa. The nurse answered on the second ring, her voice calm but alert. "Alyssa, it's Lauren," she said, her tone brisk. "I need your help. Can you meet me tonight?" "Of course," Alyssa replied without hesitation. "What's going on?" "Just something big. I'll explain when I see you." Lauren hung up, her resolve sharpening. She couldn't do this alone. The fight ahead would require allies, people she could trust, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone. Lauren sat in the dimly lit diner, her coffee untouched, the bitter scent mixing with the faint smell of frying oil from the kitchen. The booth across from her was empty, but she kept her eyes fixed on the door. Every few seconds, her fingers drummed against the table, betraying the anxiety she was trying to suppress. The bell above the door jingled, and Alyssa stepped in, her expression sharp and focused. She spotted Lauren immediately and made her way over, slipping into the seat across from her. "I came as fast as I could. What's going on?" Lauren slid a folder across the table, her voice low. "I need you to look at this." Alyssa opened it cautiously, her eyes scanning the first few pages. As she read, her brow furrowed, her expression darkening with every line. This is about your father." Lauren nodded, her voice strained. "And more. It's not just him. It's the whole department. Henson, Reynolds, and God knows who else. They've been covering this up for years." Alyssa set the folder down, her hands trembling slightly. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me verify this," Lauren said, her gaze steady. "You've got connections in the community, people who trust you. If we're going to bring this to light, we need witnesses, people who saw what happened back then." Alyssa hesitated, her eyes searching Lauren's. "You realize what you're asking, right? This could put a target on everyone involved." "I know," Lauren admitted, her voice soft but resolute. "But if we don't do this, they'll keep getting away with it, and I can't let that happen." Alyssa nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "All right, I'll see what I can do." As they left the diner, Lauren felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. Back at the precinct, the tension was palpable. Officers avoided her gaze, their conversations halting whenever she entered a room. Henson's door remained firmly shut, a silent reminder of the battles yet to come. Lauren made her way to her office, closing the door behind her as she sat at her desk. She pulled out the folder again, flipping through the pages, her mind racing. A knock at the door broke her concentration. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. Jake stepped in, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," he said, closing the door behind him. "Reynolds knows." Lauren's stomach dropped. "Knows what?" "About the file," Jake said, his voice tight. "He confronted me in the locker room this morning. Said if I didn't back off, he'd make sure I regretted it." Lauren leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. What exactly did he say? Jake hesitated, then mimicked Reynolds' voice with chilling accuracy. "You think you're some kind of hero? Keep sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, and you'll see what happens to heroes in this town." Lauren's jaw tightened. "We can't let him scare us off. If anything, this proves we're on the right track." Jake nodded, but his unease was evident. "I'm with you, Captain, but we need to be smart about this. If Reynolds is desperate, there's no telling what he'll do." Lauren stood, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll stay one step ahead. I'll take care of Reynolds. You focus on finding anything else that ties Henson to this." Jake nodded again, his shoulders straightening as he left the office. Lauren sat back down, her mind already working through the next steps. Reynolds was a problem, but he wasn't the root of it. Henson was, and if she was going to take him down, she needed more than just a file. She needed irrefutable proof. The next day, Lauren met with Alyssa again, this time at a small community center on the outskirts of the city. Alyssa had gathered a few people, elders who had lived in Birmingham for decades, who had seen and experienced the worst of the department's abuses. One man, his hands gnarled with age, spoke quietly but firmly. "I remember Jeremiah. He was a good man. They took him in the middle of the night. Said he stole something, but we all knew it wasn't true. Another woman nodded, her voice trembling. They used to come through the neighborhood like they owned it, picking people up for no reason just to scare us. Jeremiah stood up to them. That's why they went after him. Lauren listened intently, her heart aching with every word. These stories weren't just her father's, they were the stories of an entire community, silenced for far too long. As the meeting ended, Alyssa pulled Lauren aside. This is just the beginning, she said. There's more out there, more people who will come forward if they know it's safe. Lauren nodded, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Then we'll make it safe. No more silence. But as she drove back to the precinct that evening, her phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. Back off, or you'll regret it. It was from an unknown number, but she didn't need to guess who it was. Reynolds was watching, and the price of justice was becoming clearer by the second. The crowd outside the precinct swelled as the day stretched into the evening. Chants echoed through the air, growing louder and more defiant. Protesters held their signs high. Justice for Jeremiah Davis, and accountability now. Across the street, the counter-protesters had grown in numbers too, their slogans a stark and hostile contrast. Support the blue, and no mob justice. Lauren stood by the precinct's glass doors, watching the scene unfold with a sinking feeling. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a text from Alyssa. Tensions are rising fast. You need to get out here before it gets worse. Lauren slipped her phone into her pocket and turned to Jake, who had just entered the hallway. His face was pale, his movements tense. Captain, this is spiraling, he said, his voice low. I just heard from dispatch. There's talk of calling in riot control if things escalate. Lauren's jaw tightened. Riot control meant more violence, more pain. It was a hammer where precision was needed, a move that could destroy everything she was working for. No, she said firmly. We're not turning this into a war zone. I'll handle it. Jake hesitated, then nodded, his trust in her evident despite the uncertainty in his eyes. Lauren pushed open the doors and stepped outside, the cacophony of chants and counter-chants washing over her like a wave. The protesters cheered at her presence, but the counter-protesters jeered louder. Traitor! One man shouted, his face red with anger. You're selling out the badge! Lauren ignored him, her focus on the line of officers standing between the two groups. Their expressions ranged from grim determination to outright fear. She walked to the center of the street, raising her hands to quiet the crowd. Listen to me, she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. I know you're angry. I know you're frustrated, but we cannot let this turn into violence. We have to fight smarter, not harder. The protesters began to quiet, their chants fading into murmurs. But before Lauren could say more, a sharp crack split the air. She froze, her heart lurching as a wave of panic rippled through the crowd. A canister of tear gas hit the ground near the protesters, hissing as it released a thick cloud of smoke. Screams erupted as people scattered, their hands covering their faces. Lauren turned sharply toward the line of officers, her voice sharp. Who authorized that? She demanded, her anger flaring. None of the officers moved, their faces masks of confusion and fear. But Lauren's gaze caught Reynolds near the edge of the line, his hand still on his launcher. His smirk was barely concealed as he stepped back, disappearing into the chaos. The panic spread quickly. Protesters pushed against each other, trying to escape the cloud. A teenager fell to the ground, coughing violently, his hands clawing at his throat. Without thinking, Lauren ran toward him, dropping to her knees as she helped him to his feet. Breathe slowly, she instructed, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. You're okay. I've got you. The boy nodded, his eyes wide with fear as she guided him to the edge of the crowd. But just as she was about to move back into the fray, another sound cracked through the air. A gunshot. Lauren's blood ran cold as a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning for the source of the shot. Near the center of the protesters, a young woman lay on the ground, her arm bleeding heavily. Medic! Someone shouted, their voice desperate. Alyssa appeared from the crowd, her bag already in hand as she dropped to the woman's side. Lauren ran to her, her mind racing. Is she going to be okay? Lauren asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. Alyssa's face was pale, but her hands were steady as she applied pressure to the wound. She'll live, but we need to get her out of here. Lauren turned back to the officers, her voice rising with authority. We need an ambulance. Now! Jake emerged from the line, his face stricken as he grabbed his radio, calling for immediate medical assistance. Lauren turned back to Alyssa, her heart pounding. Who fired that shot? Lauren asked, her voice low. Alyssa shook her head. I don't know, but it wasn't random. Lauren's stomach churned as she looked back at the crowd. The protesters were in chaos, their fear turning into anger. The counter-protesters had retreated, their faces smug as they watched the scene unfold. Reynolds was nowhere to be seen. Lauren clenched her fists, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, and she knew exactly who it was from. As the ambulance arrived, carrying the injured woman away, Lauren turned to Alyssa. "We need to find out who fired that shot," she said, her voice firm, "and we need proof." Alyssa nodded, her expression grim. "We will. But this is just the beginning." Lauren's chest tightened as she looked back at the crowd, the anger and pain in their eyes a reflection of everything she was fighting against. The price of justice was steep, and tonight, they had paid it in blood. Lauren sat in the quiet of her office, the events of the day weighing heavily on her shoulders. The glow of her desk lamp illuminated the file in front of her. Case hash 379. Its contents had become an obsession, each page another brick in the wall of corruption that surrounded her. She traced her fingers along the faded photograph of her father, Jeremiah Davis, the lines of his face etched with both strength and sadness. The deeper she delved, the clearer it became. His death had been more than a tragedy. It had been a deliberate silencing. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. The screen displayed Alyssa's name, and Lauren picked it up immediately. "What did you find?" Alyssa's voice was grim. "I traced the bullet that hit the protester last night. It wasn't from any of the officers' standard-issue weapons. Whoever fired that shot. They wanted chaos, Lauren, and they got it." Lauren exhaled sharply, her mind racing. "Any leads on who it could have been?" "Nothing concrete yet," Alyssa admitted, "but Reynolds was spotted leaving the scene before things escalated, and he's not exactly subtle." Lauren clenched her jaw, her frustration mounting. "Keep digging. I'll handle Reynolds." As she hung up, a knock at the door made her look up. Jake entered, his expression tense. He held another file in his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges. "Captain, I found something." Lauren motioned for him to sit, but he remained standing, the urgency in his posture palpable. "What is it?" Jake placed the file on her desk, his voice low. "It's a pattern. Over the last decade, every officer who tried to speak out about misconduct, they were either forced into early retirement or had complaints filed against them, enough to ruin their careers." Lauren flipped through the file, her stomach tightening with every page. The names were familiar, some of them still whispered about in the precinct as cautionary tales. The evidence painted a chilling picture, a system designed not to protect, but to silence. "Who's behind this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jake hesitated before speaking. "Henson. Every single case ties back to him. He signed off on every disciplinary action, every dismissal. He's been keeping this department under his thumb for years." Lauren leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Henson wasn't just complicit, he was orchestrating the entire operation. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known the system was broken, but this was calculated, deliberate. "We need to confront him," Lauren said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "But we need proof, something that can't be buried." Jake nodded. "I'm working on it. There's a digital trail in the department's archives. It's buried deep, but if I can get access, we'll have everything we need." "Be careful," Lauren warned. "If Henson catches wind of this, he won't hesitate to come after you." Jake gave a small nod, his determination evident. "I'll be careful." As he left, Lauren's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. "You're in over your head. Walk away before it's too late." Lauren stared at the message, her chest tightening. The threats were becoming more frequent, more pointed. But if they thought fear would stop her, they didn't know her at all. Later that evening, Lauren met Alyssa at the community center. The nurse had gathered a small group of residents, each of them willing to speak about their experiences with police misconduct. One by one, they shared their stories, tales of intimidation, harassment, and abuse that painted a damning picture of the department's history. An elderly woman with trembling hands spoke last. "I remember Jeremiah," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "He was a good man, he fought for us, and they hated him for it." Lauren's chest ached as she listened, the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her. He had been a beacon of hope for his community, and they had extinguished his light to maintain their control. After the meeting, Alyssa pulled Lauren aside. "These people are willing to testify," she said, "but they're scared. They've seen what happens to people who speak out." Lauren nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll protect them, whatever it takes." As she drove back to the precinct, her mind raced with plans. She couldn't do this alone. She needed allies, people she could trust, and she needed to act quickly. The system was cracking, but if she didn't strike now, it would close ranks and bury the truth once again. When she arrived, the precinct was quiet, most of the officers having gone home for the night. Lauren made her way to her office, her steps heavy but determined. As she sat at her desk, she opened case hash 379 once more, her father's face staring back at her. "I won't let them win," she whispered, her voice firm despite the tears that threatened to fall. Not this time. The next morning, she called a meeting with Jake and Alyssa, outlining her plan. They would gather the evidence, protect the witnesses, and expose the corruption for everyone to see. It was a dangerous path, but it was the only way forward. As they left her office, Lauren felt a spark of hope. The system was broken, but it wasn't beyond repair, and she was willing to pay whatever price it took to fix it. The late-night hum of the precinct was quieter than usual, but the tension was thick enough to suffocate. Lauren paced in her office, her phone pressed to her ear. Alyssa's voice crackled on the other end. "I reached out to a few more people," Alyssa said. "They're scared, but some are willing to talk, off the record for now." "Good," Lauren replied, her voice tight. "But we need more than testimony. If we don't get hard evidence, Henson will bury this." "I'll keep at it," Alyssa promised. "But be careful, Lauren. They're watching you." Lauren hung up, her mind racing. She glanced at the stack of files on her desk, each one a damning piece of a larger puzzle. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. A sharp knock at her door made her look up. Jake stepped in, his face pale and strained. He closed the door behind him, his movements tense. "Captain, we have a problem," he said, his voice low. Lauren motioned for him to sit, but he remained standing, his posture stiff. "What is it?" "Reynolds," Jake began. "He approached me this afternoon. Made me an offer." Lauren's chest tightened. "What kind of offer?" Jake hesitated, his gaze darting to the floor. "He said if I stopped digging, he'd make sure I got a promotion. Better hours, better pay. All of it." Lauren's jaw clenched, her fists tightening at her sides. "And if you didn't?" Jake's eyes met hers, a flicker of fear behind them. "He didn't say it outright, but the threat was there. He knows I've been working with you." Lauren exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. "We can't let him intimidate us. This just proves we're on the right track." Jake nodded, but his unease was evident. "There's more," he said, his voice quieter now. "He hinted that Henson's pulling strings higher up. If we go after him, we're not just taking on the precinct. We're taking on the whole system." The weight of his words settled over Lauren like a heavy blanket. She had known this fight wouldn't be easy, but hearing it laid out so plainly was sobering. "Then we'll have to be smarter," she said finally. "We need a way to force their hand." Jake hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "There's someone who might be able to help, but it's a risk." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Ethan Cross," Jake said, the name barely above a whisper. "He's a journalist, used to work for one of the big papers before he started exposing corruption cases. If anyone can blow this wide open, it's him." Lauren's eyes narrowed. She had heard of Cross. His reputation for uncovering scandals was infamous, but so was his tendency to play fast and loose with the truth. "And why would he help us?" "Because it's a story," Jake said simply. "And if we give him what he needs, he'll make sure it can't be ignored." Lauren considered this for a long moment. Working with a journalist was a double-edged sword. It could bring attention to the case, but it could also make them vulnerable. One wrong move, and the entire operation could collapse. "Set up a meeting," she said finally, "but I want to meet him on my terms." Jake nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I'll handle it." The next evening, Lauren found herself in a dimly lit bar on the edge of the city, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke heavy in the air. She sat in a booth near the back, her eyes scanning the room. Jake sat across from her, his hands folded tightly on the table. "That's him," Jake said, nodding toward the door. Ethan Cross was younger than she expected, his sharp features framed by a scruffy beard. He approached their table with a casual confidence, sliding into the seat beside Jake without waiting for an invitation. "Captain Davis," he said, his voice smooth but laced with curiosity. "I've heard a lot about you." "I'm sure you have," Lauren replied evenly. "But this isn't about me. It's about the department." Cross leaned back, his eyes glinting with interest. "Go on?" Lauren handed him a folder, watching as he flipped through its contents. His expression shifted as he read, curiosity giving way to shock, then something colder. "This is big," he said finally, "but it's not enough." "That's why we need you," Lauren said. "You have the connections, the platform. If we work together, we can expose this for what it is." Cross smirked, his fingers tapping the table. "And what's in it for me?" "The truth," Lauren said simply, "and the chance to take down a system that's been broken for far too long." Cross studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, I'm in, but you'd better be ready for what comes next. Lauren's jaw tightened, her resolve hardening. I've been ready for years. As Cross left, Jake turned to her, his expression uncertain. Do you think we can trust him? Lauren's gaze lingered on the door where Cross had disappeared. I don't know, she admitted, but we don't have a choice. The hearing room buzzed with a muted tension that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Officers, community leaders, reporters, and concerned citizens filled the space, their eyes darting between the front podium and the door where the key players would soon enter. Lauren stood just outside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to calm the storm in her chest. Jake was beside her, his jaw set, the file of evidence tucked securely under his arm. Ready? He asked, his voice low. Lauren nodded, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. We don't have a choice. The door opened and the two stepped inside, the buzz of conversation dipping into silence as heads turned toward them. Chief Henson was already seated at the front, flanked by a legal representative and Reynolds, who smirked at Lauren as she walked by. It took all of her willpower to keep her expression neutral. The hearing began with the sharp rap of a gavel. This hearing is now in session, the presiding officer announced, his voice echoing through the room. We are here to address allegations of systemic misconduct within the Birmingham Police Department, as well as specific claims tied to Captain Lauren Davis and her accusations against Chief Donald Henson and Officer Michael Reynolds. Lauren sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She met the presiding officer's gaze head-on as he continued. Captain Davis, you've made serious allegations. You may present your case. She stood, her heart pounding, but her voice was steady as she spoke. Thank you. What I'm about to present isn't just about me, or even my family. It's about a pattern, a system that has allowed misconduct to go unchecked for decades. Jake handed her the file, and she stepped forward, distributing copies to the panel. In this file, you'll find documented evidence of suppressed cases, falsified reports, and deliberate actions taken to protect certain officers at the expense of the public trust. These actions were authorized by Chief Henson, and many directly implicate Officer Reynolds. Henson's attorney rose immediately. Objection. These are unsubstantiated claims. They're not unsubstantiated, Lauren interrupted, her voice rising. Every document in that file has been verified, and I have witnesses who are ready to testify. The presiding officer motioned for silence, his gaze shifting to Henson. Chief, do you wish to respond? Henson stood, his expression calm, but Lauren could see the faint lines of tension around his mouth. These allegations are nothing more than an attempt to undermine this department during a challenging time. Captain Davis has a personal vendetta, and she's using her position to settle old scores. A murmur rippled through the room, but Lauren didn't flinch. This isn't about me, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. This is about the truth. The presiding officer nodded. We'll hear from the witnesses. Alyssa was the first to take the stand. She spoke with clarity and conviction, recounting what she had seen during the protests, including Reynolds' actions and the threats she had received. Her testimony painted a damning picture of the department's culture of intimidation. When it was Jake's turn, he hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. He detailed the evidence he had uncovered in the department's archives, the patterns he had traced, and the threats he had faced from Reynolds. The room fell into a heavy silence as Jake concluded. I believed in this department, but believing in something doesn't mean ignoring its flaws. If we want to move forward, we have to confront the truth. Reynolds' smirk had vanished by the time Jake stepped down. Henson, however, remained stoic, though Lauren could see the tension in his shoulders. Finally, the presiding officer called for Henson to speak. He rose slowly, his face carefully blank as he addressed the room. I have served this department for over 30 years. In that time, I've seen more than my share of challenges. But these allegations? They're baseless. They come from a captain who can't accept the pressure of leadership. Lauren's fists clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to remain calm. The presiding officer turned to her. Captain Davis, do you have any final evidence? Lauren stood again, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. I do. And it's not just in those files. It's in the voices of this community. Voices that have been silenced for far too long. If you want proof, listen to them. Look at the patterns. This system wasn't built to serve justice. It was built to protect itself. The panel deliberated in silence as the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Finally, the presiding officer looked up. We'll recess to review the evidence. This hearing will reconvene tomorrow for a decision. As the room began to clear, Lauren caught Henson's eye. His mask of calm had slipped, revealing a flicker of anger and fear. She turned away, her resolve hardening. Outside, Jake and Alyssa stood waiting. How do you think it went? Jake asked. Lauren exhaled slowly. I don't know, but we've done everything we can. Now we wait. The morning sun cast sharp beams through the courthouse windows, but the light did little to dispel the heavy atmosphere that filled the room. Lauren sat at the front of the gallery, her heart pounding as the hearing reconvened. Behind her, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Officers, reporters, and members of the community who had gathered to witness what promised to be a pivotal moment. The presiding officer's gavel struck, silencing the room. We have reviewed the evidence presented over the past 2 days, he began, his tone measured but grave. This hearing will now deliver its findings. Lauren straightened in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Jake sat beside her, his jaw clenched, while Alyssa gave her a small, encouraging nod from the row behind. The presiding officer's gaze shifted toward Henson, who stood at the defense table, his face carefully composed. Chief Donald Henson, the panel finds credible evidence of systemic misconduct under your leadership. Furthermore, your direct involvement in suppressing investigations into police misconduct has been substantiated. A gasp rippled through the room, followed by a flurry of whispers. Lauren's heart raced as she watched Henson's mask of composure crack ever so slightly. His hands tightened on the table in front of him, his knuckles white. In light of these findings, the presiding officer continued, you are hereby relieved of your duties as chief of police, effective immediately, pending further investigation. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to document the moment, their cameras flashing as Henson stood, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. He turned toward Lauren, his eyes blazing. This is your doing, he hissed, his voice low but venomous. You've destroyed everything. Lauren stood slowly, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. No, Henson. You destroyed yourself. Henson's attorney pulled him away, whispering urgently in his ear. The former chief's departure was chaotic, a flurry of anger and resistance that only solidified his downfall in the eyes of the crowd. As the commotion settled, the presiding officer turned to the rest of the room. This hearing is adjourned. Further actions regarding the misconduct within the Birmingham Police Department will be announced in due course. Lauren exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was a victory. As she turned to leave, Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it, Captain, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. We did it, Lauren corrected, offering him a small but genuine smile. But there's still work to do. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of protesters erupted into cheers as Lauren stepped into view. Their signs, their chants, their unyielding support had carried her through this battle, and now they celebrated a victory that belonged to all of them. Alyssa appeared beside her, her phone in hand, capturing the moment. This is huge, Lauren, she said, her voice tinged with both relief and excitement. But you're right, it's just the beginning. Lauren nodded, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. We need to rebuild, not just the department, but the trust we've lost. That's going to take more than one hearing. As they made their way down the steps, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. It was the elderly woman who had spoken at the community meeting, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She reached for Lauren's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Jeremiah would be so proud of you, she said, her voice trembling. You're doing what he always wanted, fighting for what's right. Lauren felt her throat tighten, the weight of her father's memory pressing against her chest. Thank you, she managed, her voice soft but steady. I won't let him down. The woman smiled, releasing Lauren's hand before disappearing back into the crowd. Lauren stood there for a moment, taking in the gravity of the moment before turning to Jake and Alyssa. Let's get back to work. Later that evening, Lauren sat alone in her office, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The cheers of the crowd had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the precinct. She opened case hash 379 one last time, her father's photo staring back at her. The sound of footsteps broke the silence and Jake appeared in the doorway. Captain, there's something you need to see, he said, his voice tense. Lauren stood following him to the evidence room. There, spread across a table, was the digital trail Jake had uncovered. Emails, memos, and reports, all tying Henson's actions to a larger network of corruption that extended beyond the precinct. This isn't just about him, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. It goes higher, much higher. Lauren stared at the evidence, the enormity of what lay ahead settling over her like a heavy fog. She turned to Jake, her resolve hardening once more. Then we take it higher. The precinct was eerily quiet as Lauren walked through its halls late that evening. Most of the officers had gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew behind. The usual hum of activity had been replaced with a tension that weighed on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She made her way to her office, her thoughts a whirlwind of plans and contingencies. Jake's discovery had opened a door she hadn't expected, a door that revealed just how far the corruption stretched. Her phone buzzed as she entered her office. It was a text from Alyssa. "Be careful. I'm hearing chatter about someone trying to make this go away. Stay safe." Lauren stared at the message, her chest tightening. Make this go away was vague, but she knew what it implied. The people she was up against weren't going to let her dismantle their system without a fight. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jake stepped in, his face pale but determined. He carried another folder, thicker than the last, and set it on her desk. "I found more," he said, his voice low. "Emails between Henson and city officials. Some of them go all the way to the mayor's office." Lauren opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. The evidence was damning. Memos authorizing illegal detentions, directives to bury investigations, even financial transactions that hinted at bribery. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what we need." Jake nodded, but his expression didn't ease. "There's something else. Reynolds is asking questions. He knows we're closing in, and he's getting desperate." Lauren's jaw tightened. "We can't let him derail this." Before Jake could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the main hallway. Lauren stood, her heart pounding as she stepped out of her office. Reynolds was there, his face flushed with anger, shouting at one of the younger officers. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "You don't know the first thing about loyalty." The officer, barely more than a rookie, stammered a response, but Reynolds waved him off dismissively. His gaze shifted to Lauren, and his expression darkened. "Captain," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Enjoying your little crusade?" Lauren walked toward him, her steps measured but firm. "What are you doing, Reynolds?" "What am I doing?" he repeated, his laugh hollow and bitter. "What are you doing? You think you can tear this place apart and come out unscathed? You're delusional." "I'm holding people accountable," Lauren said, her tone unwavering. "Something you clearly don't understand." Reynolds stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you've won because Henson's gone? You haven't even scratched the surface. You're playing a game you can't win." Lauren didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." Reynolds glared at her for a long moment before turning on his heel and storming out of the building. The tension in the hallway lingered even after he was gone, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. Lauren took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Everyone, back to work," she said, her voice steady. "We still have a job to do." As the hallway cleared, Jake approached her again. "He's going to do something. I can feel it." Lauren nodded. "Then we'll be ready." But even as she said the words, doubt crept into her mind. She knew Reynolds was dangerous, but the stakes had risen higher than she'd anticipated. If he was desperate enough, he could cause irreparable damage, not just to her, but to the entire investigation. That night, as Lauren sat in her office, the weight of the fight ahead pressed down on her. She opened her father's case file again, her fingers brushing against the edges of his photo. "I'm not giving up, Dad," she whispered. "Not now. Not ever." Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time it was an unknown number. "You're running out of time. Walk away while you still can." The threat sent a chill down her spine, but it also fueled her resolve. She had come too far to back down now. She turned off her phone and leaned back in her chair, her mind already racing with the next steps. The breaking point was near, and Lauren knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face whatever came next. The precinct buzzed with an energy that was both tense and expectant. Officers moved cautiously, their usual banter replaced by murmurs and sidelong glances. Lauren stood in the center of the room, her presence commanding but not overpowering. The weight of the last few weeks was etched into her posture, but her eyes burned with resolve. Today wasn't just another day. It was the culmination of everything she had fought for. Jake approached her, a folder clutched tightly in his hand. "It's all here," he said, his voice steady. "Emails, financial records, the whole network. This will blow it wide open." Lauren nodded, taking the folder from him. "Good, it's time." The press conference had been hastily arranged, but the turnout was overwhelming. Reporters packed into the small briefing room, their cameras trained on the podium. Community leaders stood alongside Lauren, their presence a reminder that this fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had been silenced, ignored, and oppressed. Lauren stepped up to the microphone, the room falling silent as she began to speak. For too long, this department has failed the people it was sworn to protect, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. But today we take the first step toward rebuilding trust. She held up the folder, its significance evident to everyone in the room. What you see here is evidence of a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless. But no more. We will not allow corruption and abuse to define us. The reporters erupted into questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Lauren raised a hand, silencing them. This is not just about accountability. It's about redemption. It's about proving that we can be better, and it starts here, today. As the press conference ended, the community leaders approached Lauren, their expressions a mix of gratitude and hope. "You've done something incredible," one of them said. "But the work is just beginning." "I know," Lauren replied, "and I'm ready." Later that evening, the precinct held a town hall meeting, the first of its kind. The room was packed with officers, residents, and activists, all eager to have their voices heard. Lauren stood at the front, flanked by Alyssa and Jake. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. One by one, community members stepped forward to share their stories. An elderly man spoke about the fear he had felt for decades, watching his neighbors be harassed and ignored. A young woman recounted the night she was wrongfully detained, her voice trembling but resolute. Each story was a reminder of the damage that had been done, and the healing that still needed to happen. When it was Jake's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment before stepping up to the microphone. "I became a cop because I wanted to help people," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what that really meant. Working with Captain Davis has reminded me why I took this oath, and I'm committed to doing better, for myself, for this community, and for all of you." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. Lauren felt a swell of pride as she looked at Jake, his transformation a testament to the power of redemption. As the night wore on, conversations filled the room, some heated, some hopeful, but all necessary. For the first time, officers and residents were truly listening to each other, their shared humanity breaking through the walls of distrust. By the time the meeting ended, Lauren was exhausted but hopeful. She stood outside the precinct, the cool night air a welcome relief. Alyssa joined her, a small smile playing on her lips. "You did it," she said. "You really did it." Lauren shook her head. "We did it, and we're just getting started." As the two women stood in silence, the sound of laughter drifted from the building behind them. It was a small thing, but it was enough to remind Lauren that change was possible. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she believed they could walk it together. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the community center, casting long rays across the wooden floor. Lauren stood in the middle of the room, watching as officers and residents mingled cautiously. The gathering was informal, but intentional, a chance for the two groups to meet without the weight of uniforms or protest signs between them. Tables lined the walls, filled with coffee, pastries, and a growing stack of suggestion cards. A soft murmur filled the air as people talked in hushed tones, testing the fragile connection that was beginning to form. Lauren adjusted her blazer, the weight of her role pressing on her shoulders. This wasn't just an event. It was a step towards something bigger, something more hopeful. "Captain Davis!" a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Alyssa approaching, her ever-present phone tucked into her back pocket. "How's it going?" Lauren asked. "Better than I expected," Alyssa admitted, her lips curving into a small smile. "I've seen a couple of officers actually listening to people. That's progress, right?" Lauren nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "It's a start, but it'll take more than one meeting to rebuild trust." As if on cue, Jake appeared at her side, a clipboard in hand. "I've been talking to some of the officers," he said. "A lot of them are on board with the changes we're proposing. Some are skeptical, but that's to be expected." "What about Reynolds' old crew?" Lauren asked, her tone cautious. Jake's expression darkened slightly. "They're still resistant, but they're keeping quiet for now. I think losing Henson rattled them." Lauren's jaw tightened. "Good. Let's keep it that way." The sound of laughter drew her attention to a group near the center of the room. A young officer was crouched down, showing a boy how to tie a proper knot with a piece of rope. The boy's mother watched nearby, her face softening with a tentative smile. It was a small moment, but it sent a ripple of hope through Lauren's chest. "See that?" Alyssa said quietly. "That's why we're doing this." Lauren nodded, her throat tightening. "Yeah, it is." Later in the afternoon, the conversations grew more focused. Officers and residents gathered in small circles, discussing everything from community patrols to de-escalation training. Lauren floated between the groups, listening intently and occasionally offering her perspective. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, of skepticism, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving forward. Near the end of the event, a woman approached Lauren hesitantly. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Captain Davis," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Yes?" Lauren replied, her tone warm. The woman hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was a grainy black and white image of a younger Jeremiah Davis, standing in front of a small group of people. He was smiling, his arm raised as if he were in the middle of a speech. "I knew your father," the woman said. "He helped us organize back when no one else would. He gave us hope." Lauren's breath caught in her throat as she took the photo, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can say." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening. "He'd be proud of you. You're doing exactly what he fought for." As the woman walked away, Lauren stared at the photograph, her mind flooded with memories of her father. His voice, his determination, his belief that change was always possible. For the first time in years, she felt his presence beside her, a steadying force in the storm. By the time the event ended, the room was filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Officers shook hands with residents, some even exchanging numbers to continue their conversations. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. Outside, the sky had turned a soft orange, the sun dipping low on the horizon. Lauren stood on the steps of the community center, watching as people drifted away in pairs and small groups. Alyssa joined her, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "You did good today," Alyssa said. Lauren shook her head. "We all did. This wasn't just me." Jake approached, his clipboard now tucked under his arm. "I think we might actually be able to pull this off," he said, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks. Lauren allowed herself a small smile. "One step at a time." As they stood there, a light breeze brushing past them, Lauren felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time it felt like they were winning. Healing wasn't just a goal, it was a process, one that required courage, patience, and unyielding determination. And for the first time, she believed they were ready for it. The Birmingham Civic Hall was packed to capacity. Rows of chairs stretched across the wide floor, filled with community members, officers, and public officials. The air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and reflection, a shared understanding that this day marked the culmination of a journey far greater than anyone could have anticipated. Lauren stood just off stage, her heart pounding as she clutched the folded paper containing her speech. Today wasn't just about justice. It was about redemption, unity, and remembering the man who had inspired it all. "Captain Davis," a voice called softly. Lauren turned to see Alyssa standing nearby, her expression warm but tinged with emotion. "You ready?" she asked. Lauren nodded, though her grip on the paper tightened. "As ready as I'll ever be." The announcer's voice echoed through the hall, silencing the crowd. "Please welcome Captain Lauren Davis, whose efforts have paved the way for meaningful change in our community." Applause filled the room as Lauren stepped onto the stage. She paused for a moment, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. Familiar faces stood out. Jake seated beside Alyssa, the elderly woman who had given her the photograph of her father, the young boy who had learned to tie a knot from one of her officers. Each face carried a story, a connection to the fight they had all endured. Lauren approached the podium, the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. She unfolded the paper in her hands but found herself setting it aside. Her voice didn't need a script, it needed heart. "When I first came back to Birmingham," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I knew the challenges would be great. I knew the history, the pain, the distrust. But what I didn't fully understand was the strength of this community, the resilience, the hope that has carried us through the darkest times." The crowd listened intently, their eyes fixed on her as she continued. "This fight has never been just about me or even my family. It's been about all of us. It's about creating a system that serves and protects, not silences and oppresses. It's about acknowledging our past, no matter how painful, so that we can build a better future." Lauren paused, her throat tightening as she reached for the photo of her father that now rested on the podium. She held it up, her voice soft but firm. "This is my father, Jeremiah Davis. He believed in justice. He believed in standing up for what's right, even when the odds were stacked against him. He gave his life for that belief." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. Today we honor his legacy, not by mourning what was lost, but by committing to what we can build, together. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Lauren barely registered it. Her focus was on the photograph in her hand, her father's smile a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. As she stepped off the stage, Jake approached her, his expression a mix of pride and relief. "You nailed it," he said. Lauren smiled faintly. "It's not about nailing it. It's about making sure it sticks." Alyssa joined them, her eyes glistening. "It's sticking. Trust me." Later that evening, Lauren found herself standing outside the precinct, the quiet of the night a stark contrast to the day's events. She stared up at the building, its facade illuminated by the streetlights. This was where it had all started, and where it would continue. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from the mayor's office, congratulating her on the progress they had made. She set the phone aside, her thoughts drifting to the road ahead. The work wasn't over. The wounds of the past would take time to heal, and the scars would always remain. But for the first time, she felt hope. Real, tangible hope. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught the faint outline of her reflection in the glass doors. Behind her, she could almost see her father standing there, his hand on her shoulder, his smile one of quiet pride. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for showing me how to fight." The night air was cool as she walked away, her steps steady and resolute. The path forward was long, but it was one she was ready to walk, not just for her father, but for everyone who had placed their trust in her. The legacy of Jeremiah Davis was no longer just a memory. It was a movement, a promise, and a future. And Lauren was determined to honor it every step of the way. The early morning sunlight spilled over the Birmingham skyline, casting long shadows that stretched across the city. The precinct was quieter than it had been in weeks, the usual hum of activity replaced by a subdued stillness. Lauren stood outside the building, her gaze fixed on the horizon. This morning felt different, lighter, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. She turned as Jake walked up, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. "You're here early," he said, handing her the cup. Lauren took it with a small smile. "Couldn't sleep." Jake nodded, his expression understanding. "It's been a long road." "It has," Lauren agreed, her voice soft. She sipped the coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. "But it's worth it." Inside, the precinct was slowly coming to life. Officers filed in, their conversations quieter but less tense than before. The fallout from Henson's dismissal was still fresh, and the department was grappling with the changes Lauren had begun to implement. New policies, new training, new expectations. It wasn't easy, but there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. Lauren made her way to her office, where a stack of reports awaited her. She sat down, flipping through the documents with practiced efficiency. Each one was a reminder of the work that lay ahead, but also of the progress they had already made. A knock at the door pulled her attention. Alyssa stepped in, her smile warm but tired. "Thought I'd find you here," she said, holding up a paper bag. "Brought breakfast." Lauren gestured for her to sit, and Alyssa placed the bag on the desk. They ate in companionable silence for a moment before Alyssa spoke. "I saw the community center's schedule for next week. They're hosting another town hall." "That's good," Lauren said. "The more we engage, the better." Alyssa nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "People are starting to believe again. In the system, in each other. It's slow, but it's happening." Lauren smiled faintly. "That's all I ever wanted." As the day progressed, Lauren found herself pulled into meeting after meeting. Officers discussed the logistics of new community outreach programs, while others presented proposals for improving accountability. It was a whirlwind, but it was progress, and Lauren thrived in the momentum. By the afternoon, she found herself back outside, watching as a group of officers worked with neighborhood kids to plant a community garden. The sight was a stark contrast to the protests and confrontations that had defined the past months, the laughter, the smiles. It was a glimpse of what could be. Jake appeared beside her again, his own gaze fixed on the scene. "Hard to believe this is the same department." "It's not," Lauren said simply. "We're not the same people we were." He nodded, his expression contemplative. "You've changed a lot of minds, Captain, including mine." Lauren looked at him, her smile genuine. "You've done the same for me." As the sun began to set, Lauren returned to her office. She pulled out her father's photograph, the edges worn from handling. She placed it on her desk, the familiar face a source of strength. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from one of the community leaders she had worked with closely. "Thank you for everything. We see you, and we're with you." Lauren set the phone down, her chest swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. She thought about the road that had brought her here, the pain, the challenges, the victories, and felt a deep sense of purpose. The night fell softly over Birmingham, and the precinct quieted once more. Lauren stood at her office window, looking out at the city she had fought so hard to protect and heal. The work was far from over, but as she watched the lights flicker on across the skyline, she knew one thing for certain. This was a new dawn, and she was ready for whatever came next.